Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It's just a great pleasure for me to welcome each and every one of you to what you know is this latest installment of our Core Values Speaker Series. Many of you have been here before for this series of discussions. These are discussions where we ask a prominent person with experience in one of UMB's core values to come and talk with us about why that particular value is so important in one's personal and professional life. And we have the special honor today of having with us Lea Berman, who served as White House Social Secretary from 2004 to 2007 under the George W. Bush administration. So before any of you thinks it, this is the Perman show. Sorry, Lea. Seriously, Ms. Berman will talk to us about civility, a value that frankly seems rather hard to come by nowadays. So we're deeply grateful to you for sharing your hard-earned wisdom. Before her stint as White House Social Secretary, Ms. Berman served as Chief of Staff to Second Lady Lynn Cheney, and before that as Social Secretary for Ms. Cheney and her husband, the former Vice President Dick Cheney. She co-wrote the book, Treating People Well, The Extraordinary Power of Civility at Work and in Life. She wrote that book with Jeremy Bernard, who served as White House Social Secretary under the Barack Obama administration. And Ms. Berman has graciously agreed to sign copies of the book following our conversation here today. She has worked at Georgetown University's Center for Strategic and International Studies and for the National Republican Senatorial Committee. She's a longtime DC insider and consummate hostess. She has run her own fundraising and event planning businesses, worked on political campaigns, and she's been a full-time mother of two. Ms. Berman is the creator of America's Table, a blog dedicated to food and entertaining. Let's all welcome Lea Berman. We talked a little bit about what we were going to talk about, and Lea Berman knows that we're going to get into some substantive questions about cultivating civility in times that we really need to cultivate civility. But I think that my colleagues here would like just a little peek into the world of being White House Social Secretary, wouldn't you? Yeah. What it's like to be in charge of some very high-profile events that are very visible to the nation. So could you tell us what a social secretary in the White House, what a day in the life is like?
Mm-hmm. Well, a social secretary is responsible for every event that takes place on the White House and its grounds, with the exception of the press room and the Oval Office. So it's over 400 public events a year, many, many more private events that are never on the President or First Lady's schedules. And it's kind of a tiny social office event planning operation that runs very fast. It's like being on a hamster wheel that never really slows down because you have events every day. There will be maybe 2 or 3 on a standard day. There could be another one tomorrow. You're working on things that are happening next week, next month, 3 months on. And it's every kind of event, whether it's a First Lady and another First Lady having a quiet lunch upstairs in the family residence, to a full-blown state visit, all of the Rose Garden events, the South Lawn events, all of the receptions and parties, and the dozens of holiday events. So it's very, very hectic and therefore stressful. But I always like to say that everybody's job is stressful because we all have a concern about doing our job as best we can and maintaining a good reputation. And it doesn't mean it's any less stressful for anybody else. Stress is just something that's part of everybody's work life now.
So I suspect along the way, there are events that went perfectly, and there are probably some events that, for various reasons, nothing to do with you, did not go as well. So tell us about the most wonderful events, what that's like, and also some things where you wish it had come out differently.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, Jeremy and I wrote this book because we wanted to do something in a bipartisan way that showed that our experiences had been so very similar to each other. And you know, we work for two very different administrations, but people are all the same fundamentally. And there were two events that I loved more than any other. And one of them was the Iftar Dinner, which is this annual dinner that the president used to hold. I'm not sure they still do, which comes at the end of Ramadan, and it is a breaking of the fast dinner. And we would invite prominent Muslim clergymen, ambassadors from Muslim countries, and other distinguished people in the academic community who happen to be Muslim to come for a breaking of the fast dinner. And we timed it very carefully because you can't serve any food before the sunset. So we arranged to have the Eastern portraits covered. We brought in prayer rugs. We had an imam who came in and called the guests to prayer. And they went in, closed the doors, they prayed, they came out, and we had the dinner. And I just remember standing there, and you know, I was in the White House at a time when the Iraq War was going really badly. And it was, you know, if you worked in the White House, you didn't even want to look at the headlines every day. And just standing there and seeing this sort of expression of tolerance, given what was going on in the world, made me really proud. And the other moment that I loved that happens to also kind of relate to religion was at the Hanukkah party one year. The Marine Band always performs at all the holiday events, and they're always packed. You know, it's 500, 700 people. And the White House is actually much smaller than people realize it is. And at one point, they started to play Hava Nagila, and the group started to form a circle and dance the hora. And then they got to the end of the song and everyone cheered, so the Marine Band played it 2 more times. And by the time they were finished, there were like 3 circles going on, and it was like this moment of spontaneous joy that was so wonderful to see in the White House, because again, this expression of tolerance in an institutional form, that made me very proud. The other side of the coin, there was a visit from the president of China, and all of the negotiations had been quite contentious getting there. And the lesson in what I'm about to tell you is that just because something is not your responsibility doesn't mean it isn't your fault. The president of China.
Not
here. The president of China arrived for an official ceremony with, I don't know, 5,000 or 7,000 people on the South Lawn. And the White House announcer made a really big diplomatic error. Instead of saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, the president of the People's Republic of China," she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the president of the Republic of China," which is Taiwan and their mortal enemies. And there was this, just like a stiffening among the delegation. And of course, the Chinese assumed that that had been done intentionally because they always just do, and that's kind of how the mindset is. And then as the president began to speak, the president of China, a heckler who had been let in on a press pass started running through the crowd yelling, and the Secret Service had made no preparation for such a thing. So it took 4 minutes to get this guy off the grounds. And you could just see the Chinese becoming more and more furious. And I'm standing just inside the White House doors watching this all happen, and I see the State Department woman come racing down the hallway and go, "They're leaving, they're all leaving, they're so insulted." And I had to find someone to tell me what actually happened, because this woman had had a complete meltdown. And I found that all of the senior delegation of the Chinese group was leaving before the luncheon, which was the official luncheon and kind of the highlight of the event. So I'm racing around pulling chairs from tables all over the place and place cards and so forth. And then another person from the State Department comes to me and says, "You know, the Chinese always do this thing where they don't want us to use our own translator. So if they try to take the president's American translator, you have to make sure you keep them in the mix during the lunch." And I look over and I see these two young Chinese women. One is sitting in the chair behind President Bush's chair, and of course nobody's in the room yet, it hasn't started. And one is standing behind her looking very uncomfortable. So I go over, introduce myself, can I help you? And the woman looking uncomfortable says, I'm the American translator, but she's in my seat and she won't let me have it. So I go to the woman and I explain very politely the situation, and she pretended as though she didn't speak English, which is, interesting for a translator. And so I pulled the American girl over and I said, listen, when I get this seat open, sit in it and do not get up until this lunch is over. And I tipped, I'm not proud of this, but it was, when the State Department tells you something about a translator and the president, you take it very seriously. I tipped the woman's chair forward and she jumped up and whirled on me in anger. And just then I could see the chief of protocol, the Chinese chief of protocol, coming at me like smoke coming out of his ears. How dare you? I got my person in the seat. And just at that moment, the Marine band struck up Hail to the Chief. I was literally saved by the band. And then the lunch started and there was nothing they could do about it. So that was my worst.
So the lunch actually happened.
The lunch happened, but
they didn't walk out.
Well, no, other lesser guests came, but none of the Chinese delegation came. And so I had no control over the speaker, the announcer who made the mistake. I had no control over the Secret Service. I had virtually no control over the translator, but it was all on me.
Well, we'll see how the tariff discussions work out. They probably still remember that. So to what you're telling us about, clearly many of the guests you've dealt with in that role were heads of state, important dignitaries, and some of us think that given the fact that they're in those positions, they can command any situation. But I actually doubt that's the case. So how did you make guests feel comfortable when they're taking part in something that is as grand as a White House event? And the reason I'm asking this, Lee, is because there are probably some lessons for the rest of us. We don't hold quite those grand events, but how do you make people feel comfortable? People that on the face of it, you think know how to behave. How do we make people feel comfortable based on your experiences?
Well, we tried to make people feel as though they were welcome in the same way, whether you were Meryl Streep or you were, a councilman from Dubuque, Iowa. We made a real effort for people to feel welcome and comfortable, and we did it because we saw how intimidated almost everyone who comes into the White House is. And it is kind of a special thing. I mean, I can remember many times seeing people come up into the state floor and look around at the columns and the portraits of the presidents, and you could just see this sort of mental thing going on where they were realizing that as Americans, they shared this common heritage with all the families who'd ever lived in this house. And it is often very emotional for people. And when you see people caring about it that much, then it made all of us want to work that much harder to make them feel more welcome. So whether you're at the White House or you're having a little party at home or you're at a neighborhood event or a business event, being the person who walks up to someone else and makes eye contact and shakes their hand and introduces themselves and makes an effort is a way to make everyone feel welcome. And you can say something nice about them, even if they're wearing the most hideous necktie in the world. You could say, that's a really special necktie. You're not lying, but you're trying to establish a basic rapport. And I think this is really important in life for people to have the social skills to do this, because everything that we do in life is really based on our behavior, our manners. And manners are about a lot more than just etiquette. By creating a template of who we are on the outside, we create who we become on the inside. So our manners are the visible manifestation of our sensitivity to others. And that's why I feel like it's really important to have a positive outlook, to reach out to people. And sure, not everyone's going to respond. There's a part in the book where we write about what it's like to walk into a big party where you know absolutely nobody, and you're there for business, say, and you want to make some good connections, or it's just a social evening and you want to have fun. And one of the things that I tell people, and I've always said it, is, you can go up and do all the right things, shake hands, smile, engage people, and maybe it just isn't going anywhere. Maybe you actually really have nothing in common, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with saying, it's been so nice to meet you. I hope you'll excuse me. I'm just going to get a drink. Or the worst case scenario, when you go up to a group of people, you make eye contact, you try to talk to them, and they just stare at you dumbly. That happens, but that's not them. I mean, that's not you, that's them. You should not take that personally, and you should not let it affect your social confidence. And so, go on to the next group and find somebody who gets it. I think you'll find that most people are more than willing to meet you halfway if you make the effort. And if they don't, then why do you want to know them anyway?
Well, let's talk about civility directly. I don't think there's any question that we would all agree, I think we would all agree that there's been a precipitous decline in civility over the last several years. Maybe it's been much longer than that. I know, and we chatted beforehand, that it's certainly been an issue in the professions that we educate people to in this university. You wouldn't think that you have to talk to medical students, dental students, et cetera, about the importance of being nice to people. But there's no question that there's been a coarseness that's crept into society. And I think we're curious to know what you think is behind that. Why have we developed an increasing challenge to be civil and respectful? Yes, certainly in our political discourse, but even beyond.
I feel, and everybody says this, I feel the impersonality of the internet makes people behave in ways online that they would never do with someone face to face, and that has caused a real coarsening of the situation. We've also had people come to the fore in our political sphere who do not know how to behave with any kind of civility. They have no filters and no boundaries. And, studies have shown that bad behavior is contagious. And so when you have somebody like our current president attacking people like John McCain within his own party who could have been his ally, not to mention attacking his own staff and undermining and all of that, you create a new low of what's acceptable. Then you have other people on the other side who say, this is working for this guy, I'm going to do this too. And so we have these two very narrow extremes politically who are running the show. And us, we're all in the exhausted middle, right? Aren't you sick of it? You're so tired of how these people can't figure out how to get along. That is their job, and they're all failing at it. And I don't know what to do as a society. All I can do as an individual is treat people with kindness and set myself as an example, if I can, as a form of passive resistance. Because I will not lower myself to the level that these people have brought this country. And all they're doing are creating future American political leaders who think this is how they're supposed to behave. And that is really something to be concerned about. I mean, America is an idea. And it's based on, probably three things or more that I can think of: equal opportunity and equal rights, a tolerance for the differences of other people, and respect for the rule of law and democratic institutions. And all you have to do is pick a member of Congress or a president and say, does he serve these three purposes? There aren't that many who do anymore. And we've kind of lost sight of how we need to be, and we need to find a way to get back to it, but I'm certainly not smart enough to tell you how to do it.
Well, I have to confess to you and my colleagues that sort of in framing this next question, that I often find myself, before we walk into a dinner, my wife and I together, my saying to her, and it's probably disrespectful, no politics. And maybe some of you will admit to doing that as well with a spouse or a child or a friend. But political disagreements come up in social settings, over dinner or what have you. And what can hosts do to calm the situation down? How can we, if we find ourselves entangled in that kind of a situation, how can we settle it?
Well, you know, I think the best way to meet intense emotion is with no emotion whatsoever, to remain very detached and unengaged in the ideas that someone might be saying that you don't agree with. And so I have a few, stock responses. If someone starts on something political that I really don't agree with and don't want to talk about, I'd say, well, that's one opinion. And then I will turn to someone else at the table and change the subject. If they continue, which is really obnoxious, but I've seen it happen, you can turn to them and say, look, you're not going to change anybody's views at this table tonight, so why don't we talk about something else? Like, how about Virginia in the NCAA finals? You pick some topic that everyone's going to jump in and want to talk about, and you make it go away. And that's the only way I know to handle it. It's a form of deflection, diffusing the issue, because you have every right to refuse to talk about it. And what I think gets difficult is when someone's saying something you really disagree with, but you really don't want to get into it because it's a social setting and you're trying to be nice to your host, but you can't just let it go, because then you feel kind of like a victim, like you're agreeing with this person or worse. And so that's why I choose these phrases that are very subtle, but they're making it clear that I don't agree and I'm not talking about it.
Let's get a little closer to the workplace now. How do you manage people who, frankly, are truly unpleasant? There are some people like that. Not in this room, but they're unpleasant, and yet we have regular, unavoidable contact with them, and they with us. How do you manage that?
Well, we had kind of three methods of conflict resolution. The first is if it's someone you're just interacting with once and you're never going to see them again, and then we just ignore the bad behavior. If it's someone you work with regularly, we would diffuse and deflect as much as we could, and we would manage our way out of it. And we would use boundaries. For example, it's easy at the White House to say, oh, we never do that at the White House if someone wanted to do something that was ridiculous. And in fact, Jeremy has this great story which is in the book, but they did not let us name the person, so I'm going to tell you it was Harvey Weinstein. He was a friend of President Obama's, and he was coming to see the president, and he called Jeremy and said, I'm flying in on my plane, and then I'm going to chopper in and land on the South Lawn. And Jeremy said, no, nobody lands on the South Lawn but the president. And he said, no, it's okay, it'll be cool, I'm just going to do it. And Jeremy said to him, look, here's the story. When Ronald Reagan got shot and the Secret Service was urgently trying to get George Bush into the White House, he refused to land on the South Lawn and made them take him to the next closest helipad, because that is such a very firm tradition here, and we won't let you do that. And so he had to, travel to Dulles or however he came here and drive in like a normal person. And this is a classic example of someone who really has no boundaries, but even then you can still create boundaries using your bureaucracy, whatever you have to use as a tool to control this kind of bad behavior. And then, the worst case scenario is someone who's just a completely terrible person, a bully. And that's the absolute worst case if they're also your boss, which has happened to me twice in my life. And all you can do is emotionally detach, refuse to be drawn into their screaming fits, especially when they're doing it around other people, because I think these kinds of people don't realize that when other people see this behavior, it diminishes them in their eyes. And it makes it harder for them to do their jobs because they don't want to be treated like that. They don't want anything to do with these people. And so I think in these situations, you have to be very calm and controlled. You defend yourself and you say, that's not what happened, that's not how it worked out, so forth, so that you are not really enraging this person any further, but you're also not giving them any kind of room to maneuver. And the one other thing I would say about that is, and this applies more to women than men, is you can never, ever cry in that situation, because then you're finished. So go cry in the bathroom afterward, but keep it together and never, ever leave a confrontational meeting in a huff or because you're upset. Stick it to the end, because you have to think about what's going to happen the next time you see all those people, and it will be so much more difficult for you. So however unpleasant it is to sit through it, get through it, keep your dignity, and leave. And then bottom line with both of those jobs, I didn't do it immediately, but I eventually left because it's unhealthy to work in that kind of an environment.
So, you know, civility is one of our 7 core values. That's why we're having this session. We've got our core values literally painted on walls in parking garages. All of our core values are important to me, and I'm not just saying this today. So many of them actually require civility if we're going to be faithful to our core values. What are the larger lessons that we need to take? How does our insistence, our capacity for civility benefit us in our own lives? How does it benefit society in general? In other words, I'm asking a fundamental question. Maybe it's naive. What's so important about being civil?
We're not suggesting that you do what your mother told you to do and be nice. We're advocating for this because it's incredibly self-interested. When people like you, they are more helpful. They are more pleasant. If you make the initial effort to talk to someone, to make eye contact, whether let them merge into traffic, any little thing, you don't even have to interact with them literally. It makes them feel better. It makes you feel better. And, we're not saying be a pushover. We're saying have some standards about your personal behavior that can be an example for others, and then allow that to serve you in your own life because it makes your life less stressful and easier. So these larger issues of punctuality, I mean, we were talking about this a little earlier. I can't tell you how many doctor's offices I've left and never gone back to because I was kept waiting over an hour without any explanation. There are a million doctors in the world. If I'm going to be treated like that, I'm just going to go somewhere else. And in your professional life, it's so disrespectful to keep people waiting. Various administrations have different kinds of sort of personalities that reflect the president. So a lot of complaints in the Clinton years were about the fact that he would keep events and people waiting for hours and hours and hours. People would kind of complain a little about George Bush because he was always 10 or 15 minutes early to everything, and they weren't ready. And so, you just got to get it right on the dime. It's really important. It's an example of respect for others that we've kind of lost a little bit. But there are other things, just being kind to someone, just generally kind. If someone is not being kind in return, having the perspective to think perhaps this person is having a really rough day. Maybe he's worried about money. Maybe her kid is sick. Maybe she's just really, really tired. And so when people behave badly, you don't need to take it so personally. And I read something recently, and I wish I remember who said this. It might have been Churchill. He said, when you're 20 years old, you worry about what everybody thinks of you. And when you're 40 years old, you don't care what anybody thinks about you at all. But then when you're 60 years old, you realize no one was ever thinking about you anyway. So, it's not really important that if someone likes you or dislikes you just on the face of things, earn it. Just go out and earn it.
Well, I want to make sure that we leave enough time here for all of you to participate. We clearly have a very engaging guest here who is very happy to answer your questions. We have microphones set up, and please feel comfortable to come up and ask Ms. Berman a question.
I could have 1,000,001 questions, but I do have one that's not so much about civility, but clearly you had a very demanding schedule when you were White House secretary, social secretary, and a family at home. How did you balance the time required of you in your profession with your family life?
I didn't. I did a really bad job of it, honestly. And my husband stepped in and did everything. My daughters were 10 and 14 when I started. And he really was not only the primary breadwinner, but he was the person who kept the household running because I was rarely there. And I couldn't have done it without him. And there have been other times in my life where he had jobs where I did everything. So I feel like we did kind of a balancing partnership over the last 36 years. And so we've been lucky for each other that that's been the case. I think it's really tough to do, and especially because there's still not a lot of institutional things in place to help women be in their careers and continue to grow in their careers and raise their children in the way they want to raise them. And that's just something we need to continue to work on. But if I could go back to the last question you asked me,
Please.
which I forgot to mention, this is really important, I think. Humor is such a valuable tool wherever you are, in the office place, at work, at home. It is really a great thing to be able to reduce tension in a room by cracking a joke, or just change the subject by saying something, making people relax. And when people relax and are less stressed, they're more likely to cooperate. And so being that person in the room who is willing to crack a joke, even in front of the boss, makes you someone worthy of respect. It shows that you have real confidence. And you know, all the presidents are pretty good at this. Well, not the current one, but because he is really truly humorless, if you think about it.
I invited a Republican this time.
Yeah, like a liberal Republican, I have nowhere to go. I'm standing out here by myself right now. But when Ronald Reagan, for example, who was a great off-the-cuff Irish jokester, was invited to visit the Queen of England, they went riding, and they were riding horses in Windsor Great Park, and the Queen's horse suddenly had this prolonged bout of flatulence. And she said, "Oh, yeah, I'm sorry." And he said, "It's quite all right, Your Majesty. I thought it was the horse." And you know, even Jimmy Carter, after he left the White House, said, "You know, it's so nice now that I'm out of the White House that people wave at me and use all their fingers." And my old boss, George W. Bush, was a funny guy, but somehow in public cracking jokes, it never quite worked. But when I was leaving the White House, the Bushes gave me a dinner, and my family was invited, and he was seated next to my daughter, who was at the time 14 and at boarding school. And he was a boarding school kid too. And he said, "How are you doing?" And she said, "Actually, I'm flunking Algebra 2, but I haven't worked up the nerve to tell my mother." And he just stopped the table conversation and looked at me and said, "Mom, Alice is flunking math, but I don't want you to worry about it because I didn't do so well in school either, and things worked out okay for me."
That's a good point.
And that kind of off-the-cuff humor is a great tension reliever.
Yeah, and you know, I've certainly learned along the way that for people that are in leadership positions, and there are many in this room, self-deprecating humor.
Mm-hmm. It's the only safe kind.
Yes, you need to be able to make fun of yourself. It tends to work.
Civility and getting people to respond to invitations.
To
I have an
respond to
event.
RSVPing?
Yes. I mean, I have an event this weekend, and I'm having to call people and say, "Could you please tell me if you're coming or not?" I mean, I know you must have run into, I think a lot of people actually try and RSVP to the White House, but for those of us who don't have that, you know, for work events like meetings, I'll have people not accept a meeting until the morning of the meeting. So if you could speak to that.
It is such a problem, and that
Really
is so rude. I'm glad you brought that up, because honestly, before I went to work as the social secretary, my husband and I used to entertain a lot in Washington, and I was always giving dinner parties and things. And I'd think, wow, half these people aren't responding. I guess I'm not very important. And then I went to work in the White House and found half the people don't respond to the White House. We were calling thousands of people at Christmas time saying, "Will you be coming to the Christmas party you were invited to?" And they're like, "Huh? Oh, well, yeah, I guess." And then you have to get all their Social Security information, Social Security, date of birth, place of birth, and all of that. And it all has to be compiled in these vast lists that we would give to the Secret Service. And every day there'd be, 1,500, 2,000 people on these lists that they would have to clear in. So accuracy was really important, attention to detail. And no matter what we did, and even for state dinners, we would call people 2 or 3 times. And it's so frustrating to me and so rude.
So to focus that a little bit more, and it's sort of the flip side, how do you handle people who don't RSVP and then show up?
Well, it would depend on the event there, because if it were a small dinner, they just wouldn't be able to come in. If it was a 1,000-person reception, it'd be okay. But in your home when that happens, that's really awkward. And I think you have every right to say, you know, you didn't respond, so I wasn't expecting you, so I don't have a seat. So let me see what I can do. And if you can squeeze them in, it's nice of you to do it, but boy, I'd never invite them again.
Nancy, it never happens to us, does it? Yeah.
You wouldn't believe how many people complain about their seating at dinners at the White House.
Ah.
I mean, Jeremy has a story of one night when they were doing a huge dinner and there were tables set in every room on the state floor. One of the big donors came to him just as they were getting seated, and she said, "You couldn't have given me a worse seat than putting me in the red room with the Obamas in the state dining room." And he just smiled and said, "There are no bad seats at a White House formal dinner," and walked away. And you know, I often had people who would come for a dinner and they would realize they're not at the president's table and they would think they belong there. And you know, you can only put 10 or 12 people at one of those tables. And you know, they would come to me and they would complain as people were already half seated. And I would say, you know, "I'm so sorry," and I'd look to see where they were sitting, you know, whose table they were sitting at. And I'd say, "You know, I know you were supposed to be at the president's table, but the Secretary of Transportation asked specifically that you be seated with her. And so that's why you're there." And then they'd be like, "Oh, well, they wanted me." And then they get over it. You know, it's ego.
I will share with you and my colleagues here that I remember planning years ago with my in-laws for our wedding, just a few years ago. And issues came up from guests that were going to certainly be invited as to whether they were going to be seated at the head table. I have a question about head tables. The way I handled it was to insist to my father-in-law that we have a huge table all the way around the room so that everybody was seated at the head table. Obviously, that did not happen. How do you handle that? You know, this so-called place of honor. Have we discarded head tables at events?
No, I think people still do it. And if you want to be a stickler for protocol, you can always refer to an Amy Vanderbilt or something. But I feel like logic is the best thing. You know, if you have a guest of honor, certainly he should be seated next to the host or hostess. You know, that's their expectation as the guest of honor. And from there, it's really your estimation of who belongs where. And there's no wrong way to do it from the point of view of the host, because it should be who you care about most.
Okay. Probably I won't need to know that again, but thank you. I wanted to, of course, thank Lea Berman for coming and sharing wisdom to us. I have something else to tell you that I think speaks to the person that is here among us today. And I hope this won't embarrass you. Ms. Berman actually refused payment for this appearance. She said it didn't seem right to charge a university. So, Lea, we are instead making a donation to an organization that you support. It's called SOME, S-O-M-E, which stands for So Others Might Eat. It's an interfaith organization that helps the poor and homeless in Washington, D.C. SOME meets the daily needs of people they serve with food and clothing and health care. And breaking that cycle of homelessness is done by offering services like affordable housing, job training, addiction treatment to the poor, the elderly, those with mental illness. Lea Berman is one of us.
Thank you.
The least we can do, in addition to supporting the organization you care about, is to offer you something that is very Maryland. If you'd like to take it out, people will understand, I think.
Oh, thank you. Oh, how nice. Look at that.
A
Isn't
little bit
that
of Maryland
beautiful?
crab, you know.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much.
You're
It's
welcome.
really, really
You're welcome.
kind.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, here. I thought you were
And
handing me the bag.
I'll hand you the bag, too. When will I ever get manners? Huh?
No. You're just left holding the bag.
Now, remember, Lea Berman is going to be signing copies of her book over at that part of the room. So grab your lunch, get in line, or vice versa. And I thank you all for coming out, and thank you again.
My pleasure.